I never planned to become the villain of my neighborhood. In fact, when I bought the property, I didn't plan on having a neighborhood at all. The land was old, quiet, and just far enough from town that the real estate agent described it as peacefully isolated. 52 acres of rolling greenery, a farmhouse built in the late 70s, and, most importantly, a lake. Not a decorative pond. A real, spring-fed lake covering nearly 12 acres, with a dam and water control system installed decades earlier for agricultural irrigation. The deed was very clear. The lake was mine. The dam was mine. The water rights were mine. I triple-checked that part because water rights can get messy. This one wasn't. The previous owner had used the lake for crop irrigation, fish stocking, and emergency fire suppression. The entire system, spillway, floodgate, drain valve, was legally tied to the land. I bought the place to get away from people. That should have been my first clue that people would eventually come to me. For the first 2 years, everything was perfect. I worked remotely, fished in the mornings, and watched the fog roll off the water at sunrise. Deer came down to drink at dusk. On still nights, the lake reflected the stars so cleanly it felt like standing at the edge of space. Then the construction started. At first, it was distant. Tree clearing sounds from the far eastern boundary. Trucks kicking up dust. I checked county permits online and saw a large residential development had been approved on the neighboring land. Luxury homes. Gated community. Homeowners association. I shrugged. As long as they stayed on their side, I didn't care. That lasted about 6 months. One afternoon, while I was repairing a fence near the dam, I noticed something new across the lake, survey flags. Bright orange, sticking out of the ground like warning signs. On my shoreline. I walked over, pulled one out, and checked the coordinates stamped on the plastic. I already knew what I'd find. They were wrong. Every single flag was at least 20 to 30 feet inside my property line. I assumed it was a mistake. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. Excavators. I drove down to the lake and felt my stomach drop. They were digging. Not near the water. In the water. They'd brought in floating platforms and were driving pylons straight into the lake bed, maybe 60 yards from shore. Workers in hard hats were shouting measurements back and forth, completely unconcerned with the fact that they were building something in the middle of a lake they didn't own. I parked my truck and walked straight up to the nearest supervisor. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" He looked at me like I was a delivery driver interrupting his lunch break. "Utility installation," he said. "You'll need to talk to the HOA board if you've got concerns." "I don't care about the HOA," I replied. "This is my lake." He laughed. Actually laughed. "Buddy," he said, "this lake is part of the community water feature. Always has been." That was the moment I realized this wasn't a mistake. Someone had told them the lake wasn't mine. I went home, pulled out my survey documents, deed, and county water rights certification, and called the number listed on the construction sign. That call was my first real introduction to the HOA. The woman on the phone introduced herself as Marjorie, president of the Lakeside Ridge Homeowners Association. Her tone was polite in the way people get when they believe they have authority over you. She told me the lake had been integrated into the development's shared infrastructure plan. I told her she was trespassing. She told me I was confused about property boundaries. I emailed her copies of the deed, the survey, and the water rights documentation. She didn't reply. Instead, the construction accelerated. Within weeks, a concrete platform had risen from the center of the lake. Pipes ran from the structure toward the HOA property. Thick cables followed. I drove by one evening and saw engineers inspecting turbine housings. That's when it clicked. They weren't building a dock. They were building a small hydroelectric power station. Using my dam. Using my water. Without permission. I contacted a lawyer the next morning. He was very interested. But he was also very slow. Cease and desist letters were sent. The HOA's legal team responded with pages of vague claims, easement arguments, and references to implied communal use. Meanwhile, construction continued. And then the HOA made their first real mistake. They sent me a letter. Not from a lawyer. From the HOA board. It stated that due to community safety concerns, I was no longer permitted to access the dam controls, as they were now critical infrastructure. They told me they'd installed a lock on my dam. I drove down there immediately. Sure enough, a brand new industrial lock had been installed on the control gate housing. I stood there staring at it, heart pounding, not with fear, but disbelief. They had just put it in writing that they knew the dam controls existed. They acknowledged them. And they tried to take them from me. That letter would later become Exhibit A. But at the time, all I felt was rage. I cut the lock off. Cleanly. Carefully. Took photos before and after. The next day, Marjorie showed up at my house with 2 other board members and a security guard. She smiled like this was a friendly chat. "We really need you to cooperate," she said. "This project benefits everyone." "Not me," I said. She sighed, like a disappointed teacher. "You don't understand how these things work," she replied. "Once infrastructure is in place, ownership becomes flexible." That was the exact word she used. Flexible. That night, I sat on my porch watching the lights from the construction site reflect off the water. I thought about the dam. The drain valve. The emergency overflow system that hadn't been used in decades. I thought about how the lake existed only because I allowed it to. And for the first time, I wondered, what would happen if it didn't? If you're ready, I'll continue with part 2, where the power plant goes live. The HOA celebrates prematurely. They ignore legal warnings. I quietly prepare the valve they forgot I owned. HOA built a power plant on my lake, then panicked when I drained the water overnight. Part 2, when community infrastructure went live. The HOA didn't just ignore my warnings. They buried them. A week after Marjorie's little visit, the construction site transformed overnight. What had been a muddy platform with exposed rebar suddenly looked polished and permanent. The concrete housing was sealed. Pipes were pressure tested. Electrical conduit ran underground toward the development like veins carrying lifeblood. And then the signs went up. Lakeside Ridge Renewable Energy Project, coming soon. There were balloons one morning. Balloons. Blue and green, tied to temporary fencing. Like this was a county fair instead of a hostile takeover of private property. I watched from my truck as residents gathered near the shoreline on the HOA side. Folding chairs. A rented podium. A banner bragging about sustainability and energy independence. I recognized Marjorie immediately. She stood at the center of it all, smiling like she'd personally solved climate change. My lawyer told me not to attend. So I didn't. But I listened. The sound carried across the lake, speeches about innovation, shared resources, and leveraging underutilized natural assets. Someone actually used that phrase. Underutilized. My lake. They flipped the switch just after noon. I knew because I felt it. A subtle vibration passed through the water, barely visible ripples spreading outward from the concrete structure. The turbines engaged with a low hum, steady and confident. Lights flickered on along the HOA shoreline, and people clapped. They cheered. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, jaw clenched, knowing exactly how illegal this was, and exactly how much trouble they were about to be in. Or so I thought. That night, I got another letter. This one was colder. More official. The HOA's legal counsel informed me that the lake was now designated as a shared utility resource under a revised development plan approved by the county. They claimed my dam constituted a legacy structure and that operational control had transferred to the HOA for safety and compliance reasons. It was complete nonsense. But it was dangerous nonsense. Because the county's stamp on the document was real. Somehow, the HOA had pushed paperwork through without notifying me, likely using old agricultural records and deliberately vague boundary descriptions. My lawyer was furious, but also honest. Fixing this, he said, will take time. Time was exactly what the HOA assumed they had. They began advertising. Powered by our own lake. Homes sold faster. Property values jumped. Local news ran a feel-good segment about the neighborhood generating clean energy from an existing body of water. They never mentioned who owned it. Then things started going wrong. Not big things. Little ones. Fluctuating power output. Occasional shutdowns. Engineers blamed seasonal flow variation. Spring-fed lakes are stable, but not infinite. The turbines needed consistent head pressure, and they were pushing the system hard. I knew that. I also knew something they didn't. The lake level they were operating at wasn't natural. Years earlier, the previous owner had raised the baseline water level by adjusting the dam's overflow threshold to create better irrigation reserves. The entire ecosystem had adapted to that artificial equilibrium, including the turbines. They were tuned to a level that existed only because the dam allowed it. And the HOA did not own the dam. One evening, a pair of engineers showed up unannounced at my gate. They were polite. Nervous. They asked if I'd noticed any changes in water flow. I told them the lake was behaving exactly as designed. They asked if I had access to the dam controls. I smiled. Of course, I said. It's my dam. They exchanged looks. That's when I realized something important. The HOA board had never told their own engineers who actually controlled the water. They assumed. And assumptions, in systems like this, are fatal. A few days later, Marjorie emailed me. Her tone had changed. She talked about collaboration. About mutual benefit. She suggested a compensation arrangement, annual fees, access rights, even naming the facility after the lake. Still no apology. Still no acknowledgement that they'd trespassed, lied, or tried to steal control. I replied with a single sentence, remove the structure from my lake and restore the site. She didn't respond. Instead, the HOA installed security cameras pointed directly at the dam. That was mistake number 2. Because now I had documented proof they knew the dam existed, knew I accessed it, and were monitoring my lawful use of my own property. My lawyer's voice over the phone was calm but sharp. "They're building a dependency," he said. "If that power station fails, they're exposed." "How exposed?" I asked. "Entire development loses partial power," he replied. "Emergency systems included." That night, I walked down to the dam alone. The moon was bright. The water was high, lapping near the reinforced edge of the spillway. I unlocked the housing and stood there listening to the water move, controlled, restrained, waiting. I thought about the lock they'd put on my property. The letters. The lies. And then I remembered something buried in the original engineering documents. The drain valve wasn't meant for daily use. It was meant for emergencies. For structural inspection. For full drawdown. It could lower the lake by several feet in hours if fully opened. And legally, I was allowed to use it whenever necessary for maintenance. No permission required. I closed the housing and went back to the house. I didn't open the valve that night. Not yet. First, I needed something else. Evidence. So I waited. Over the next week, I documented everything. Water levels. Power output fluctuations visible from the plant's control lights. Security camera placements. HOA communications. Then I got the email I'd been waiting for. A formal notice from the HOA stating that any unauthorized manipulation of lake levels would be considered sabotage of community infrastructure and subject to legal action. My lawyer replied. He attached my deed. My water rights. Photos of the lock they installed. Photos of the power plant. And one simple statement, my client retains sole authority over lake water levels. The HOA didn't respond. That night, the turbines kept humming. Homes glowed warmly along the shoreline. And everyone slept peacefully. Including Marjorie. I, however, did not. I put on my boots, grabbed a flashlight, and walked down to the dam. The stars reflected perfectly on the water. For the last time. Where, the valve opens, the lake begins to disappear, the turbines scream, and the HOA wakes up to absolute chaos. Yes, this is where everything starts to go very wrong for the HOA. HOA built a power plant on my lake, then panicked when I drained the water overnight. The night the lake began to vanish, the world is quiet in a way that feels intentional. No wind. No insects. Just the soft, endless sound of water pressing against concrete, waiting for permission to move. I unlocked the dam housing with my original key. Inside, everything looked exactly as it had for years. The control wheel was cold under my gloves. The gauge needle sat steady, reflecting the artificially elevated water level the HOA had grown dependent on. I paused. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood the weight of what I was about to do. Once the valve opened, there would be no hiding it. No undoing it. Water systems don't negotiate. They obey physics, not committees. I took a photo of the gauge. Then another of my watch. Then I turned the wheel. The drain valve didn't scream or jerk. It moved smoothly, like it had been waiting. A deep vibration passed through the concrete as water began rushing into the bypass channel beneath the dam, diverting flow away from the lake and toward the downstream creek. At first, nothing looked different. That's how lakes work. They don't panic. They don't rush. They simply begin to empty. I stayed for 20 minutes, monitoring the gauges, adjusting the flow to a controlled but significant drawdown rate, well within the dam's design parameters, well within my legal rights for inspection and maintenance. By the time I locked the housing again, the water level had already dropped 4 inches. That was enough. I went back to the house, poured a cup of coffee, and waited. The first alarm triggered. I heard it faintly at first, a distant, warbling sound carried across the water. Then another. Then a third. The turbines were complaining. Hydroelectric systems rely on head pressure. As the lake level dropped, the intake flow destabilized. Cavitation began forming inside the turbines, tiny vapor bubbles collapsing violently against metal blades. To engineers, that sound is unmistakable. To HOA board members asleep in million-dollar homes, it was just the power flickering. The turbines shut down automatically. The lights along the shoreline went dark. Backup generators kicked in with uneven rhythm, coughing to life like something dragged unwillingly from sleep. By sunrise, the lake was visibly lower. Not empty. Just wrong. Mud appeared along the shoreline in places that had been underwater for decades. Rocks emerged like exposed bones. The reflection of the sky fractured, broken by widening bands of brown and gray. And right in the middle of it all, the power plant. My phone exploded. Missed calls. Voicemails. Texts. Marjorie left 5 messages in under 10 minutes. Her voice was no longer polite. This is highly irresponsible. You are endangering the community. You need to stop immediately. This is criminal. We are calling the authorities. I didn't answer. Instead, I drove down to the lake. There were already people gathered on the HOA side. Residents in pajamas, pointing, whispering, filming with their phones. Children asking why the water was gone. Someone crying, not metaphorically. Actually crying. Engineers ran around the power station, shouting into radios. One of them slipped in the mud and barely caught himself on a railing. The turbines were silent. Dead. I parked my truck on my side of the lake and stepped out. Several people noticed me immediately. A man I didn't recognize shouted, "Hey! Are you the one who owns this land?" "Yes," I replied. Another voice, louder and angrier, "Did you do this?" "I'm performing dam maintenance," I said calmly. Marjorie arrived moments later, red-faced and shaking. She marched toward me, phone in hand. "You can't do this," she hissed. "You're destroying infrastructure." I gestured toward the exposed concrete platform. "That structure shouldn't be there," I said. "It's trespassing." She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "You think you can just drain a lake overnight and get away with it?" I looked at her phone. "Who are you calling?" I asked. "The county," she snapped. "The power authority." "The police." "Good," I said. "They should see this." By noon, the water level had dropped nearly 4 feet. Fish flopped helplessly in shrinking pools near the shore. Birds circled, confused. The intake pipes of the power plant now sucked air instead of water. The system was beyond offline. It was compromised. And everyone knew it. County officials arrived first. Then environmental regulators. Then the power authority. They asked questions. Lots of questions. Why was there a hydroelectric facility here? The mood shifted. By mid-afternoon, the county ordered an immediate halt to all power operations. Red tags were slapped on control panels. Engineers were told to stand down. One official pulled Marjorie aside. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw her face go pale. The county issued a formal notice. The power plant was built without proper authorization from the dam owner. The lake was not a shared utility resource. The HOA was in violation of multiple property and environmental regulations. And the water, still draining. Slowly. Legally. That night, emergency meetings were held in the HOA clubhouse. Backup generators struggled to keep essential systems running. Residents panicked about property values. News vans arrived. And I slept better than I had in months. Because the lake wasn't gone. It was just reminding everyone who truly controlled it. Legal fallout: emergency court filings, the HOA begging for access, and the moment they realize the lake cannot be refilled without me. Yes, this is where the HOA's confidence completely collapses. HOA built a power plant on my lake, then panicked when I drained the water overnight. When the lawyers started running the HOA, thought the county shutdown was the worst of it. They were wrong. The next morning, I was served with emergency court papers. The HOA had filed for an injunction, accusing me of sabotage, environmental damage, and reckless endangerment of critical infrastructure. They wanted the judge to order me to immediately restore the lake to its previous level. My lawyer laughed when he read it. Not because it was funny. Because it was desperate. They're asking the court to force you to operate their power plant, he said. On your property. Using your water. We filed our response before noon. It included proof of ownership, water rights documentation, dam maintenance logs, county shutdown notices, environmental compliance records, photos of trespass and unauthorized construction, and one very important detail. The lake couldn't simply be refilled. It was spring-fed and rainfall dependent. The dam controlled outflow, not inflow. Once water was released, nature decided when it returned. By the time the emergency hearing started that afternoon, the water level was down nearly 6 feet. The exposed shoreline had doubled. The power plant looked like a stranded ship. The judge listened carefully. Then asked one question that changed everything: did the HOA have written permission from the dam owner to construct or operate this facility? The HOA's attorney hesitated. That hesitation was fatal. No, he admitted. But we believed. The judge cut him off. Belief is not authorization. The injunction was denied. Not only that, the judge issued a temporary restraining order against the HOA, prohibiting them from interfering with my dam or water management activities. Marjorie reportedly left the courtroom in tears. Outside, reporters swarmed. They asked me how it felt to drain the lake. I corrected them. I didn't drain it, I said. I managed it. That quote ran everywhere. Meanwhile, the consequences began piling up. Without the lake at operational level, the turbines were useless. Without the turbines, the development lost its primary energy source. Backup generators burned fuel at alarming rates. And the HOA's insurance company, they pulled coverage. Unauthorized infrastructure, they said, was excluded. Environmental regulators weren't thrilled either. Lower water levels exposed decades of sediment. Fish kills were documented, but so was the cause: unapproved industrial use of a private lake. The fines started arriving. Daily. Residents demanded answers. Emergency HOA meetings turned hostile. Board members resigned. Marjorie stopped answering her phone. And then came the call. Not from the HOA's lawyer. From Marjorie herself. Her voice was small. She asked if we could talk. I agreed. We met at the lake. Or what remained of it. Mud cracked underfoot as we walked. The power plant loomed awkwardly, surrounded by dry ground. Pipes hung uselessly in the air. This never had to happen, she said quietly. I stopped walking. You're right, I replied. It didn't. She admitted they'd assumed the lake would be easier than negotiating. That once the structure existed, I'd be forced to cooperate. They never considered that cooperation goes both ways. She asked what I wanted. I told her. Full removal of the power plant. Restoration of the lakebed. Payment for environmental remediation. Written acknowledgement of ownership and water rights. And a permanent easement barring HOA infrastructure from my land. She stared at the exposed lakebed. That will bankrupt us, she said. I shrugged. You should have checked the deed. By sunset, the lake was quiet again. Lower. But peaceful. And for the first time, the HOA understood something fundamental. They never owned the water. They just borrowed it. Without permission. The first piece of the power plant came down 3 days later. A crane rolled in at dawn, escorted not by HOA security, but by county inspectors. Red and white tape cordoned off the area. Workers moved carefully, documenting every bolt, every cut, every section of pipe removed from the lakebed. The HOA wasn't supervising. They weren't allowed to. This was no longer their project. It was evidence. Residents gathered again, but this time there were no balloons. No banners. No speeches. Just quiet murmurs as the structure that had been marketed as a symbol of progress was dismantled piece by piece. I stood on my side of the lake and watched. Marjorie didn't come. Neither did most of the board. Their lawyer did, though, standing off to the side, phone pressed to his ear, face permanently tense. Environmental crews followed the demolition team. Contaminated sediment was removed. Fish rescue operations relocated what survived to downstream waters. The exposed lakebed was treated and stabilized. The invoices were staggering. And they weren't done. Residents started asking questions. Hard ones. Why hadn't they been told the lake was privately owned? Why were HOA funds used for a project without secured rights? Why were their dues now tripling to cover emergency costs? An emergency HOA meeting was called. It lasted 6 hours. It ended with 3 board members resigning on the spot. Marjorie held on longer than anyone expected. Until the lawsuits began. Homeowners sued the HOA for misrepresentation. Buyers sued over false advertising. Vendors sued for unpaid bills. Even the backup generator supplier sued over unpaid fuel costs. The HOA's finances collapsed under the weight. And then Marjorie resigned. No speech. No announcement. Just a quiet update to the HOA website. Board president stepped down effective immediately. The power plant was fully removed within 2 weeks. The lake, meanwhile, began its slow recovery. Spring-fed systems are patient. Water seeped back in from underground channels. Rain helped. The exposed mud softened, then darkened, then disappeared beneath returning waves. By late summer, the water line was close to where it had been before, this time at a level I chose. The dam remained untouched. No locks. No cameras. Just water moving where it was allowed to. The HOA never rebuilt. They couldn't afford to. Instead, they paid. A settlement was reached quietly.